The suitcase fell over before I even saw her face. I remember that detail first, not her voice, not the child, not even the way the wind moved through the trees, just that single moment when the worn fabric tipped sideways and spilled a small pink shoe onto the dry park grass, and something inside my chest tightened so suddenly it felt like I had missed a step on a staircase I didn't know I was climbing. I stood there for a second longer than I should have, maybe 2, maybe 3, long enough for the world to keep moving around me while I stayed completely still, because the truth is, I didn't want to believe what I was seeing. My daughter, Emily, sitting on a wooden bench like she didn't belong anywhere else, 2 suitcases at her feet, scuffed, overfilled, the kind you pack when you don't know where you're going next, and beside her, her little girl holding onto her leg like the ground itself wasn't safe. I didn't run to them, I didn't call out her name, I just watched. Because something about the way she sat there, shoulders slightly forward, eyes unfocused, told me this wasn't just a bad day, this was something deeper, something that had already happened before I arrived, something that had already changed everything. My hands felt colder than they should have under the afternoon sun, and I became aware of my breathing, slow, controlled, the way it gets when you are trying not to react too quickly, because reacting too quickly means you don't understand yet. And I needed to understand. I took 1 step forward, then another, my shoes pressing into the gravel path as the sound seemed louder than usual, each step carrying a question I hadn't asked out loud yet. When she finally looked up and saw me, her expression didn't change the way it used to when she was younger. There was no quick smile, no relief, just a pause, like she was deciding what version of the truth she could afford to give me. "Mom," she said quietly, and that was it, just 1 word. But it held something heavy, something unfinished. I stopped a few feet away from her, close enough to see the redness around her eyes, close enough to notice the way her fingers tightened slightly around the handle of the suitcase. I glanced at the child, then back at her, and asked the simplest question I could find, the kind that sounds ordinary but isn't. "Why aren't you at work?" And for a moment, she didn't answer. The wind moved again, lifting a strand of her hair across her face, and she didn't brush it away. She just looked down at the ground like the answer might be written there somewhere. "I'm fine," she said, too quickly, too softly, and I felt something settle inside me, not anger, not yet, something quieter, sharper, the kind of feeling that tells you the truth is about to surface whether someone wants it to or not. I didn't interrupt her, I didn't push, I stayed silent, because silence has a way of making people feel it, and after a few seconds, she did, her voice lower now, almost like she didn't want the words to exist once they were spoken. "They told me to leave," she said, and the air around us seemed to shift, not dramatically, not visibly, but enough that I could feel it in the way my chest tightened again, and I realized, in that exact moment, that whatever had happened here, whatever had brought her to this park with 2 suitcases and nowhere else to go, was not going to end quietly, and they didn't know that yet. I did not move right away after she said it. I just stood there and let the words settle, because sometimes the first version of the truth is not the real one, sometimes it is only the safest one, and I had learned a long time ago that if you wait, if you stay quiet long enough, people will tell you more than they plan to. Emily kept her eyes on the ground, her hand still gripping the suitcase handle like it was the only thing keeping her steady, and the little girl pressed closer into her leg, small fingers curling into the fabric of her jeans. I noticed the child's shoes were slightly dusty, not just from the park, but from walking, more walking than a child that age should have to do, and that detail stayed with me longer than anything else, because it meant this had not happened all at once. This had been building, step by step, decision by decision, until it brought them here. "What do you mean?" "They told you to leave," I asked, keeping my voice even, not sharp, not soft, just steady, and she hesitated again, her shoulders rising slightly as she took a breath that did not seem to go all the way through. "His father said it was better this way," she replied, and there it was, the first crack, small but clear. I felt my fingers curl slightly at my side, not from anger, not yet, but from recognition, because I had heard that kind of sentence before, dressed up in calm words, hiding something colder underneath. "Better for who?" I asked, and she let out a small breath that almost sounded like a laugh but did not reach her eyes. "For their family," she said, and then after a pause that lasted just long enough to matter, "He said I was making things complicated." I nodded once, slowly, as if I were simply processing information, but inside, something had already begun to shift, something quiet and precise, like a door closing somewhere deep in a house you thought you knew. I stayed silent again, and this time it worked even faster. She glanced at me, then away, and added, He said our name makes people uncomfortable, and there it was, the real sentence, the one that carried weight, the one that explained everything without explaining enough. I felt my chest tighten again, but my face did not change, because this was not the moment for reaction, this was the moment for clarity. I looked past her for a second, at the suitcases, at the way they leaned slightly toward each other like they had been dropped in a hurry, and then back at her. "And your job?" I asked, and she swallowed, her fingers tightening again. "They said I should not come back," she answered, and her voice was smaller now, like each word cost more than the last. I tilted my head slightly, not in confusion, but in focus. "Who said that?" I asked, and this time she looked directly at me, just for a second, before her gaze dropped again. "He did," she said quietly. "My father-in-law." And for a moment, the park seemed too quiet, like the sound had been pulled out of it. I could hear a car passing somewhere in the distance, a dog barking far away, but none of it felt close, none of it felt important, because there was only one thing that mattered now, one detail that did not fit, one piece that had been placed where it did not belong. I let a few seconds pass before I spoke again, enough time for the silence to stretch, enough time for her to feel it. "No one makes that decision without approval," I said calmly, and she frowned slightly, confusion replacing some of the exhaustion in her expression. "What do you mean?" she asked. And I looked at her, really looked this time, at the way she was trying to understand a situation that had already moved beyond her, and I realized something very simple, something very clear. They had already decided her place, they had already decided her value, and they had done it without knowing who they were dealing with. I reached for the handle of one suitcase and lifted it easily, the weight telling me everything I needed to know about how quickly she had been made to leave. "Get in the car," I said quietly, not as a suggestion, not as a question, just a statement, and when she hesitated, I added, just as calm, just as steady, "There will not be a fight." I paused for half a second, just enough for the words to settle before the next part landed exactly where it needed to. "There will be a lesson." I did not look back at the park after that, not at the bench, not at the gravel path, not at the place where everything had just shifted, because once you understand what you are dealing with, there is no value in looking at where it began, there is only value in deciding what comes next. The car door closed with a soft, controlled sound, and for a moment, none of us spoke. The little girl sat quietly in the back seat, her small hands folded in her lap now, her eyes watching everything with the kind of awareness children develop when the world around them stops making sense. Emily sat beside me, her shoulders still slightly tense, like she had not yet allowed herself to believe that she was no longer alone. I started the engine and pulled away from the curb slowly, not rushing, not hesitating, just moving forward the way I always had, steady and deliberate. The road ahead stretched out in a straight line, and I kept my eyes on it, because clarity does not come from looking everywhere, it comes from focusing on what matters. A few minutes passed before she spoke again, her voice quieter now, not defensive, just uncertain. "Mom, I do not understand," she said, and I nodded once, because that was expected. Confusion is what follows when someone realizes the story they were told does not match the reality they are in. "That is because they did not want you to understand," I replied calmly, keeping my hand steady on the wheel, and she turned slightly toward me, searching my face for something I had not yet shown her. "He said the company was not really yours," she continued, and I allowed a small pause to settle between us before answering, not to create tension, but to let the weight of what she said fully exist. "Of course he did," I said, my tone even, almost thoughtful. "That is how control works." She frowned, her brow tightening as she tried to follow. "He said he helped build it, that he had a say," she added, and I could hear the hesitation in her voice, the part of her that still wanted to believe that there had been some logic, some fairness in what had happened. I let out a slow breath, not from frustration, but from recognition, because I had seen this before, many times, in many forms, people who believe proximity gives them ownership, people who mistake access for authority. "Emily," I said quietly, and she turned fully toward me now, "no one gives me permission to own what I built." The words were simple, but they landed exactly where they needed to. She stared at me for a moment, her confusion shifting into something else, something closer to realization, but not fully formed yet, not until she asked the question that had been waiting just beneath the surface. "Then why did they act like they could decide everything?" she asked, and I allowed myself the smallest hint of a smile, not warm, not cold, just certain, because no one corrected them, I answered, and the silence that followed felt different now, not heavy, not uncertain, but focused. like a line had been drawn that only I could see clearly at this point. We turned onto a wider road, the kind lined with businesses and glass buildings that reflected the late afternoon light, and I could feel her watching me, waiting for something more, something clearer. But clarity is not something you hand to someone all at once, it is something you let them step into, piece by piece. Where are we going? She asked after a moment, and I did not answer immediately, not because I did not know, but because I wanted her to feel the shift before I named it. I slowed slightly at a red light, the car coming to a smooth stop, and then I looked straight ahead and said, "We are going to fix a mistake." My voice remained calm, controlled, but there was something underneath it now, something firmer, something that does not need to raise its volume to change the direction of everything. The light turned green, and I pressed the accelerator gently, the car moving forward without hesitation. "They think they removed you," I continued, my tone steady, "but they do not understand what they actually touched." I could feel her breath catch slightly beside me, not from fear, but from the beginning of understanding, and I kept my eyes on the road as I finished the thought in the same quiet, unwavering voice, "And that is where their mistake begins." The building came into view before she realized where we were going, tall glass reflecting the late afternoon sun, clean lines, quiet authority, the kind of place that does not need to announce itself because everyone who matters already knows what it is. I turned into the entrance without slowing down, the tires rolling smoothly over the polished driveway, and I could feel her shift slightly beside me, her eyes moving from the structure to me and back again, trying to connect something that had never been explained to her properly. "Mom, why are we here?" she asked, her voice careful, not challenging, just uncertain, and I did not answer right away. I parked in a reserved space near the front, the kind most people do not question but always notice, then turned off the engine, the quiet that followed settling around us like a held breath. I reached for the door handle and stepped out, the air cooler here, cleaner, carrying that faint scent of polished stone and conditioned space. I walked around the car without rushing and opened the back door first, offering my hand to the little girl. She looked at me for a second, then placed her small hand in mine, trusting in the way children do when they sense something steady. I helped her down and closed the door gently, then turned to Emily, who was still sitting inside, her expression caught between confusion and something else, something closer to realization. "Bring your things," I said calmly, and she hesitated for half a second before stepping out, lifting one suitcase, then the other, the weight pulling slightly at her arms, a visible reminder of how abruptly she had been forced to leave. We walked toward the entrance together, the glass doors sliding open before we even reached them, a small detail, but not an accident. Inside, the lobby was quiet, controlled, the kind of quiet that comes from people knowing exactly what they're doing and where they belong. A receptionist looked up immediately, her posture straightening the moment she saw me. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Carter," she said, her tone respectful, certain, and I nodded once in acknowledgement, not slowing my pace, not needing to, because everything was already moving the way it should. Beside me, I felt Emily's steps falter slightly, just enough to notice, just enough to confirm what she was starting to understand. We crossed the marble floor, the sound of our footsteps soft but clear, and I did not look at her yet. I let her see it for herself, let her connect the details. The way people greeted me without hesitation, the way no one asked questions, the way nothing here required explanation. We reached the elevators, and one of them opened almost immediately, as if it had been waiting. I stepped inside, holding the door as she followed, her grip on the suitcase tighter now, not from fear, but from the shift happening inside her. The doors closed smoothly, sealing us into a quiet space that felt different from the one outside, more focused, more contained. She finally turned to me, her voice lower now, more careful than before. "Mom, what is this place?" And I looked at the floor indicator for a second before answering, not because I needed time, but because timing matters, especially when truth changes everything. "This is where they made their decision," I said calmly, and her brow furrowed, confusion still present but thinning. "But they said," she started, then stopped, because the sentence no longer made sense even to her. I let a small silence sit between us before finishing the thought she could not complete. "They said a lot of things," I replied, my tone steady. "That does not make them true." The elevator moved upward, floor by floor, each number lighting up in quiet succession, and I could feel the tension in her slowly turning into awareness, the kind that does not come all at once, but once it starts, it does not stop. The doors opened again, revealing a hallway lined with glass offices and closed doors, people inside moving with purpose, focused, unaware of the shift about to reach them. I stepped out first, the little girl still holding my hand, and Emily followed, slower now, her eyes taking in everything, and as we walked forward, I spoke again, not louder, not sharper, just clearer. No one removes my daughter from her position without my approval, I said, and this time, I did not need to look at her to know that the words had landed exactly where they needed to, because some truths do not need explanation, they simply need to be said at the right moment, and that moment had just arrived. The hallway seemed longer than it needed to be, not because of distance but because of what was building with every step. I could feel the shift beside me without looking, the way Emily's pace had slowed just slightly, the way her breathing had changed, more controlled now, more aware, like she was trying to catch up to something that had already moved ahead of her. The little girl's hand remained steady in mine, warm, trusting, a quiet anchor in the middle of everything that was about to unfold. We passed a series of glass offices where people glanced up briefly, then straightened in subtle ways that most would not notice, but I did, I always did. Acknowledgement without interruption, respect without question, the kind of response that does not come from titles on paper but from understanding exactly where authority sits. I stopped in front of a large door at the end of the hall, the nameplate polished, understated, and I rested my hand on the handle for a second before opening it, not hesitating, just allowing the moment to settle into place. Inside, the office was quiet, structured. Sunlight filtering through tall windows that overlooked the city, everything arranged with intention, nothing excessive, nothing careless. I stepped inside and let the door close softly behind us, and for the first time since we left the park, I turned fully toward her. Emily stood there with both suitcases still in her hands, as if she had not yet been given permission to put them down, her eyes moving across the room, taking in details she had never been shown, connecting pieces that had always been there but never explained. You can set those down, I said calmly, and she did, slowly, carefully, as if placing them somewhere meant something more than just releasing weight. The little girl moved closer to her, still quiet, still watching, and I crossed the room to the desk, not sitting yet, just standing behind it, my fingers resting lightly on the surface. I did not rush the silence, I let it do its work, let it settle around us until there was no space left for misunderstanding. Mom, she said finally, her voice lower than before, more certain but still searching. Why did no one ever tell me? And I held her gaze for a moment before answering, not with apology, not with explanation first, but with clarity. Because you were not meant to need it, I said, my tone even. You were meant to live your life, not manage mine. She shook her head slightly, not in disagreement, but in disbelief. But they made decisions like they owned everything, she said. And I nodded once, acknowledging the truth of that statement without accepting its implication. They made decisions because no one stopped them, I replied, and then I stepped around the desk, closing the distance between us just enough to shift the energy in the room. And now they will understand what that means, I added, not louder, not sharper, just certain. She looked at me then in a way she had not before, not as a daughter looking for comfort, but as someone beginning to see something deeper, something she had been protected from until now. And I could see the question forming again, the one she was finally ready to ask fully. This is your company, she said, not as a question but as a realization, and I met her eyes without hesitation. Yes, I answered simply, letting the word carry its full weight without decoration. The room fell quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet now, not uncertain, not heavy, but focused, like everything had aligned into a single direction. I walked to the phone on the desk and pressed a button, my movements calm, unhurried, because timing matters more than speed. Send Mr. Whitman up, I said into the receiver, my voice steady, controlled. And then I placed the phone back down without waiting for a response, because none was needed. I turned back to Emily, who was watching me now with a clarity that had not been there before, and I gave a small, measured nod, not reassurance, not comfort, but something stronger, something final. Now, I said quietly, we are going to correct what they think they understand. Time has a way of slowing down when you know something is about to happen, not because the clock changes, but because your awareness sharpens, every second stretching just enough for you to see what others miss. I did not sit down, I remained standing near the desk, my posture relaxed but deliberate, because position matters in moments like this. Emily stayed where she was, close to the suitcases, as if part of her was still anchored to the version of reality she had walked in with, but her eyes were different now, clearer, more focused, no longer searching for answers but preparing to understand them. The little girl had moved to the chair by the window, her small legs barely reaching the edge, quietly watching the city below as if she instinctively stepped away from the tension in the room. I glanced at her briefly, then back to the door, not impatient, not waiting in the way most people do, but ready. There is a difference. A soft knock came sooner than most would expect. Precise, controlled, the kind that signals confidence without asking permission. "Come in," I said, my voice steady, and the door opened. Robert Whitman stepped inside with the same presence he carried everywhere, composed, assured, the faint hint of a smile that suggested he believed he understood the situation before a single word had been spoken. His eyes moved quickly, first to me, then to Emily, then to the suitcases, taking in details, building his version of the story in seconds. "Mrs. Carter," he said smoothly, closing the door behind him. "I was not aware you were coming in today," and I gave a small nod, acknowledging the statement without confirming it, because awareness is not something I needed from him. "I was not aware you were making executive decisions either," I replied, my tone even, not confrontational, just precise, the kind of sentence that does not need to be raised to land exactly where it should. His expression shifted slightly, not enough for most people to notice, but enough, a brief tightening around the eyes. "A recalibration. I believe there has been some misunderstanding," he said, stepping further into the room, maintaining that same calm exterior. "I was acting in the best interest of the company." I let a short silence follow his words, not to challenge him, but to let him hear them fully, because sometimes people reveal more when they think they are explaining themselves, and removing my daughter was part of that interest. I asked, not raising my voice, not softening it either, just holding it steady, and he turned slightly toward Emily, as if acknowledging her presence for the first time. Though we both knew he had already assessed it, it was a necessary adjustment, he said carefully, choosing his words with the confidence of someone who had not yet been corrected. "Her position required a certain alignment with our standards." I nodded once, slowly, letting that sentence settle into the room, into the space between us, into the understanding that was forming whether he recognized it or not. "Our standards," I repeated, not as a question, but as a reflection, and then I took one step forward, not aggressive, not abrupt, just enough to shift the balance of the room. "Tell me, Robert," I continued calmly, "when did you decide those standards included overriding ownership?" The word ownership did not come out louder than the rest, but it carried weight. It always does when used correctly. His posture remained composed, but there was a pause now, a fraction longer than before, the kind that appears when certainty meets something it did not expect. "I think you may be overstating the situation," he replied, his tone still controlled, but less fluid now, less certain, and I watched him for a moment, not with anger, not with judgment, just with clarity, the kind that does not need emotion to be effective. "No," I said quietly, "I think you have been understating it," and I let the silence return once more, because this time, it was not empty. This time, it carried the beginning of something he had not prepared for, something he had not accounted for when he made his decision, and as I looked at him, I realized the shift had already happened. He just did not know it yet, and that was exactly where I needed him to be. I watched him carefully as the silence stretched, not because I was waiting for an answer, but because I was measuring how long it would take for him to realize that the ground beneath him was no longer stable. Robert Whitman was not a careless man. He was the kind who built control slowly, layer by layer, decision by decision, until people around him stopped questioning where that control came from, and that was exactly why this moment mattered. Because for the first time, he was standing inside a structure he did not fully understand, and he could feel it, even if he would not admit it yet. He adjusted his stance slightly, a small shift of weight, the kind people make when they are recalculating. "If there has been a miscommunication," he began again, his voice still composed but no longer as effortless, "we can address it appropriately," and I let the words pass without interruption. Because this was not about communication, it was about authority, and those are not the same thing. I took another step closer, not enough to invade space, just enough to remove distance. "You already addressed it," I said calmly. "You removed her access, you reassigned her responsibilities, and you made it clear she was no longer part of this company." I paused just long enough for each point to land, not as accusations, but as facts. "Those are not misunderstandings, Robert, those are decisions." His jaw tightened slightly, barely noticeable, but there, and his eye shifted for a fraction of a second toward the desk, toward the space he had assumed operated under his influence. "I acted within the structure that was presented to me," he replied, choosing his words carefully now, and I nodded once, because that sentence told me everything I needed to know, not about what he had done, but about what he believed. that is the problem, I said quietly. You believed the structure was yours to interpret. I could feel Emily watching both of us now, not confused anymore, but alert, following every word, every shift, understanding the difference between what had been said to her and what was actually true. I turned my attention back to him, my voice steady, controlled. Let me make something clear, I continued, not raising my tone, not sharpening it, just placing each word exactly where it belonged. This company does not operate on assumptions, it operates on ownership. The word settled into the room with a weight that did not need emphasis, and for the first time, he did not respond immediately, the pause longer now, more visible, the kind that signals the beginning of recognition, not agreement, but awareness, and that was enough. I did not press further, I did not repeat myself, I let the silence do what it needed to do, because pressure applied too early weakens the outcome. And I had no intention of weakening anything. I walked back toward the desk slowly. Not turning my back fully, just repositioning, maintaining control of the space without making a display of it, and then I spoke again, quieter this time, but more final. You said her position required alignment with your standards, I repeated, and he nodded slightly, cautious now. Yes, he said, and I let a brief moment pass before finishing the thought in a way he had not expected. Then you should understand this, I said, my voice even. The only standard that matters here is mine. The words were simple, but they shifted something in the room, something that could not be undone once acknowledged. I saw it in his posture, in the way his confidence did not disappear but changed, tightened, recalculated, because confidence built on assumption does not vanish, it adapts, and now he was adapting. If that is the case, he replied slowly, then I would expect that to have been communicated more clearly, and I almost smiled, not because the statement was correct, but because it revealed exactly how he thought, how he justified, how he maintained control. It was, I said calmly, you just were not the one it needed to be communicated to. The silence that followed was different now, not neutral, not uncertain, but defined, like a line had been drawn and neither of us needed to point to it to know it was there. And as I stood there, looking at him without raising my voice, without stepping further, without doing anything that resembled force, I knew something had already shifted beyond words, something he could feel even if he could not yet name it, and that was the moment I had been waiting for, the moment where understanding begins, not because it is given, but because it becomes unavoidable. I did not rush to fill the silence after that, because by now the room was doing the work for me, the kind of work that does not require raised voices or repeated arguments, just clarity placed in the right space at the right time. Robert stood still, but not in the same way as before. There was a difference now, subtle but undeniable. His posture remained straight, his expression controlled, but the ease was gone, replaced by something tighter, more calculated, as if every next word required more effort than the last. I let my gaze rest on him for a moment longer before turning slightly toward the desk, not dismissing him, just shifting the center of gravity back to where it belonged. I picked up a thin folder that had been resting there, its surface clean, untouched, and I opened it without hurry, flipping one page, then another, the soft sound of paper moving through still air, a small detail, but one that carried its own weight. You mentioned structure, I said calmly, my eyes still on the documents. Let us talk about structure, he did not interrupt, which told me everything I needed to know about how much his position had already shifted. I turned the folder slightly so he could see, not stepping forward, not offering it, just allowing visibility. These are the original ownership filings, I continued, my tone steady, not summaries, not revisions, the original. I paused briefly, then added, signed, registered, and never transferred. His eyes moved to the page. And for the first time, the reaction was not controlled immediately. There was a flicker, small, fast, but real, the kind that happens before someone rebuilds their expression, before they decide what they will show and what they will not. I closed the folder gently, not to hide it, but because I did not need it open any longer. The point had already been made. You built your decisions on access, I said, looking at him. Again, you mistook that for authority. He inhaled slowly, measured, and then nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement that the conversation had moved beyond where he expected it to go. If that is accurate, he said carefully, then I would expect there to be formal communication to prevent this kind of situation. And I allowed myself a brief pause, not because I needed to think, but because I wanted him to hear the next words clearly, without distraction. There was, I replied quietly, you just were not included in it. the sentence settled into the room with a different kind of weight now, not just corrective, but definitive, and I could see it in the way he processed it, not rejecting it, not arguing against it immediately, but adjusting around it, the way someone does when they realize the map they were using is no longer accurate. I stepped closer to the desk again, placing the folder down with deliberate care, aligning it with the edge. Small actions. Controlled actions, reinforcing what had already been established without needing to repeat it. Behind me, I could feel Emily's presence shift again, not uncertain anymore, not questioning, but steady, as if something inside her had finally settled into place, and that mattered more than anything else in that room. I turned my attention back to him one last time, my voice calm, unchanged, but carrying a finality that had not been there before. You removed her from a position you did not have. The authority to control, I said, each word placed carefully. You made a decision that does not belong to you. I paused, just enough for the distinction to exist fully, then continued, and now we are going to correct that. He held my gaze, and this time, there was no attempt to immediately respond, no quick adjustment, just a moment of stillness where understanding had finally caught up to him, not complete, not comfortable, but undeniable, and that was the moment I had been building toward. Not confrontation, not conflict, but recognition, because once someone recognizes the truth of a situation, everything that follows becomes inevitable. And as I stood there, in the same calm posture, in the same steady tone, I knew something had already been decided long before he walked into that room. He just had not known it yet, and now, he did. The room did not change, but the energy inside it did, and that was always the moment that mattered most. Not when words were spoken, but when they settled, when they began to reshape how someone saw their own position. I could see it in the way Robert Whitman held himself now, still composed, still controlled, but no longer certain in the way he had been when he walked in. Certainty had been replaced by calculation. And calculation meant he was no longer leading the situation, he was responding to it. I did not move immediately. I let that shift take its full form, because interrupting it too soon would only give him space to rebuild confidence he no longer had the foundation for. Behind me, I could feel Emily standing straighter now, no longer shrinking into the edges of the room, no longer holding herself like someone waiting to be told where she belonged. That part had already changed, and that was not something I needed to say out loud. It was something she had already stepped into. On her own, I turned slightly toward the desk again, not breaking eye contact completely, just enough to reposition, to maintain control of the pace without appearing to force it. There is one more thing, I said calmly, my voice steady, and his attention sharpened immediately, not because of the words themselves, but because of how they were delivered, quiet, deliberate, final. I opened a second drawer this time, pulling out a smaller document, thinner, but more precise, and I placed it on the desk without sliding it toward him, just letting it exist there between us. This is the executive authority record, I continued, my tone unchanged. Every major operational decision requires a single approval signature. I paused briefly, then added, mine. The word did not need emphasis, it carried its own weight. His eyes moved to the document, and this time, he did not attempt to mask the reaction immediately. There was a pause, longer than before, a moment where he had to reconcile what he was seeing with what he believed had been true. And that moment was enough. I did not need more than that. You reassigned her position, I continued, each word placed carefully. You removed her access, and you made that decision without that signature. I tapped the edge of the document lightly, not to draw attention, but to anchor the statement in something tangible. That is not a structural misunderstanding, I said, looking at him again. That is a violation of authority. The word violation did not come out harsh. It did not need to. It was precise, controlled, and that made it more effective than any raised voice could have been. He exhaled slowly, his posture adjusting again, not collapsing, not retreating, but shifting into something more defensive, more measured, if that is the interpretation. He replied carefully, then I am sure it can be reviewed and resolved internally. And I nodded once, because that was exactly what he would say. The instinct to contain, to reframe, to pull the situation back into a space where he felt more comfortable, more in control. It will be reviewed, I said calmly, but not in the way you are expecting. I let that sit for a second before continuing. Because this is not about correcting a process, I added, my voice steady. This is about correcting an assumption. He held my gaze, and this time, there was no immediate response, no attempt to redirect, just a moment of stillness where he understood that the conversation had moved beyond negotiation, beyond explanation. into something more definitive. I stepped slightly to the side, opening the space between us just enough to shift the dynamic again, not closing him in, but not giving him room to regain control either. You assumed you had the authority to decide who belongs here, I said, my tone calm, unwavering. You assumed you could define value based on your standards. I paused, just long enough for the weight of those words to settle fully, then finished the thought in the same measured voice, and you acted on that assumption. The room felt quieter now, not empty, but focused, like everything unnecessary had been removed, leaving only what mattered, and as I looked at him, I could see it clearly, the exact moment where realization replaced confidence. Not completely, not comfortably, but enough to change what would happen next, and that was all I needed, because once someone understands that their assumption was wrong, everything that follows becomes inevitable, and I had already decided what that would be. I did not speak right away after that, because this was the moment where silence carried more weight than anything I could add, the kind of silence that forces a person to sit inside their own realization without distraction. Robert Whitman stood there, still composed on the surface, but no longer anchored in the same certainty he walked in with. I could see it in the way his eyes no longer moved as freely, the way his posture held itself just a fraction tighter, like he was holding something in place that no longer wanted to stay there, and I let that happen. I let him feel it fully, because understanding does not come from being told, it comes from recognizing something you can no longer deny. Behind me, Emily had not moved, but she was no longer the same person who had walked into this room with 2 suitcases and nowhere to go. There was a steadiness in her now, quiet but present, the kind that does not need to be announced to be real. I reached for the folder again, not opening it this time, just resting my hand on it lightly, grounding the moment in something tangible. There is a difference, I said calmly, my voice unchanged, between believing you have control and actually having it. I let that settle before continuing. You operated under belief, I added, looking at him directly. I operate under fact. The distinction did not need explanation, it was already clear, and for the first time, he did not try to redirect the conversation immediately. He did not step in with another measured response. Instead, he took a slower breath, his gaze shifting briefly to the side before returning. Recalibrating, not retreating, but no longer advancing either. If your position is that this authority was never delegated, he said carefully, choosing each word with more precision than before, then I would expect there to be consequences that align with that structure. I nodded once, because now we were speaking in terms that actually mattered, not perception, not assumption, but consequence. There will be, I replied simply, not raising my voice, not adding emphasis, just stating it as something that already existed, not something that needed to be decided in this moment. I stepped slightly closer to the desk again, maintaining the same controlled pace, the same deliberate movement that had defined everything up to this point. But understand this, I continued, my tone steady, this is not about punishment. I paused just long enough for the distinction to register. This is about correction. His expression shifted again, not dramatically, but enough, because correction implies something deeper than consequence. It implies that what happened cannot remain as it is, that it will be changed, adjusted, brought back into alignment whether someone agrees with it or not, and that was something he could not ignore. You removed her from a position she earned, I said, each word measured, each one placed without force. You made that decision based on standards that do not apply here. I let the silence return for a moment, not empty, but full, holding the weight of everything that had already been said, everything that no longer needed to be repeated. Then I continued, quieter now, but more final. That will be reversed. The words did not come out as a threat, they did not need to, they were simply a statement of what would happen next. And that made them more powerful than anything else I could have said. He held my gaze, and for a moment there was no response at all, no attempt to negotiate, no attempt to reframe, just a stillness that confirmed what had already shifted. He understood now, not everything, not completely, but enough to know that the position he thought he held did not exist in the way he believed, enough to recognize that what came next would not be shaped by him, and that was all I needed. I turned slightly toward Emily then, not breaking the moment, just extending it, including her in it in a way that mattered. You are returning to your position, I said calmly, and her breath caught just slightly, not from surprise, but from the confirmation of something she had only begun to understand moments ago. Not because of this conversation, I added, my tone steady, but because it was never his to take from you in the first place. I let that settle fully, then looked back at him one last time, not with anger, not with challenge, just with clarity, the kind that leaves no space for Misinterpretation, and that, I said quietly, is where we begin to fix what you thought you could change. The words had already been said, but what mattered now was what followed them, not in sound, but in action, because statements without movement are just ideas, and I had no intention of leaving anything in that room as an idea. I remained still for a moment longer, allowing everything to settle exactly where it needed to, allowing the shift to fully take hold. Robert Whitman did not speak immediately, and that silence was no longer resistance, it was processing, the kind that comes when there is no clear path back to the position you thought you held. He adjusted his jacket slightly, a small, controlled movement, but one that revealed more than he likely intended, because people only make those adjustments when they are recalibrating, when they are preparing to move from one position into another. If that is the direction, he said finally, his voice still measured but noticeably more careful, then I assume there will be a formal review of all related actions. I nodded once, because that was the only logical next step, and logic was something I understood very well. There will be, I replied calmly, and it will be thorough. I did not add anything more to that sentence, because I did not need to. The weight of it was already clear, not as a threat, but as a certainty, and certainty has a way of shaping behavior without needing reinforcement. I stepped past him then, not brushing against him, not forcing space, just moving with the same steady control that had defined everything up to this point, and I reached for the door, opening it with a smooth motion, not as a dismissal, but as a signal. The conversation inside that room had reached its conclusion. What came next would happen outside of it. I turned back slightly, just enough to meet his eyes one more time. You will coordinate with legal and compliance, I said, my tone even. They will outline the corrections that need to be made. He held my gaze for a brief second, then nodded, not out of agreement, but acknowledgement, and that was enough, because acknowledgement is where compliance begins. He stepped toward the door, passing me with the same controlled presence he had entered with, but not the same certainty, and I watched him leave without following, without adding anything further, because there was nothing left to say to him in that moment. The door closed quietly behind him, and the room shifted again, not in tension, but in release. I turned back toward Emily, and for the first time since we arrived, the space felt clear, not empty, but settled, like everything unnecessary had been removed. She stood there, still, but not uncertain, her shoulders no longer tight, her hands no longer gripping anything for balance. She was simply standing, present, aware, and I could see it in her eyes, the exact moment where everything she had been told outside this building no longer held weight inside it. I walked toward her slowly, not rushing, not softening, just steady, and I stopped a few feet away, giving her space, not closing the distance completely, because this was not about comfort, this was about clarity. What happened to you out there, I said quietly, was based on someone else's belief. I let that settle before continuing. What happens from this point forward will be based on reality. She nodded slowly, her breath steady now. Her voice when she spoke was different, not fragile, not hesitant, just clear. I understand, she said, and I held her gaze for a moment, confirming it, not questioning it, because understanding like that does not need to be tested. It reveals itself in how someone stands, how they speak, how they carry themselves. I glanced briefly toward the suitcases still resting near the door, then back to her. You will not need those here, I said calmly, and she looked at them for a second, then back at me, and something small but important shifted in that moment. She stepped forward, leaving them exactly where they were, not out of carelessness, but out of recognition. She no longer needed to hold onto them, and that was the point. I gave a slight nod, acknowledging that choice without commenting on it, and then I turned toward the desk once more, reaching for the phone again, not as a reaction, but as the next step in a sequence that had already been set in motion long before any of us walked into this room. Human resources, I said when the line connected, my voice steady. Prepare the reinstatement documents and restore full access immediately. I paused briefly, then added, effective now. I placed the receiver down gently, the sound soft but final, and as I looked back at Emily, I knew something had already been restored that no document could fully capture, something quieter, stronger, and far more permanent, and that was exactly how it should be. The room remained quiet after the call ended, but it was no longer the kind of silence that carried tension. It was the kind that follows resolution, where everything that needed to shift has already begun to move, and what remains is simply allowing it to unfold. I stood still for a moment, not because there was nothing left to do, but because timing matters even after decisions are made. Moving too quickly can make something feel uncertain, and there was nothing uncertain about what had just been. set in motion. Emily did not speak right away, and I did not expect her to. Understanding does not always come with immediate words. Sometimes it comes with stillness, with the way a person stands differently, breathes differently, sees the same room through a completely different lens. I watched her for a second, not evaluating, just observing, and I could see it clearly now. The hesitation that had followed her into this building was gone, replaced by something quieter but stronger, a steadiness that does not depend on reassurance, only on truth. The little girl shifted slightly in her chair by the window, her feet brushing softly against the floor as she turned to look back at us, her expression calm, no longer uncertain, as if even she could sense that something had been corrected without needing to understand the details. I walked toward the desk again and picked up the folder I had set down earlier, closing it fully this time and placing it back where it belonged. Small actions, deliberate actions, reinforcing order, because order is what prevents situations like this from happening in the first place. There will be follow-up, I said calmly, not as a warning, not as a concern, just as a fact. Processes will be reviewed, authority will be clarified, and this will not happen again. I did not look at her immediately as I said it, because this part was not about comfort, it was about structure, and structure needs to be understood, not softened. After a moment, I turned back toward her, and she met my gaze without hesitation this time. He really thought he could decide everything, she said quietly, not with anger, not with disbelief, just with clarity, and I nodded once, because that was the simplest truth in the entire situation. People do that, I replied, my tone even, when no one shows them where the line is. I let that settle for a second before adding, now he knows. The words did not carry satisfaction, they did not need to. This was not about winning, it was about correction. And correction does not require emotion, it requires precision. She glanced briefly toward the door, then back at me. What happens to him? She asked, and I considered the question for a moment, not because I did not know, but because the answer mattered in a different way. He adjusts, I said finally, my voice steady, or he removes himself from a position he does not understand. I paused slightly, then added, those are the only two outcomes available to him now. She nodded slowly, absorbing that, not questioning it, because by now, she understood how decisions worked here, not through opinion, not through influence, but through structure. I walked past her toward the window where the little girl sat, and I crouched slightly, bringing myself closer to her level without breaking the calm tone of the room. Are you comfortable? I asked gently, and she nodded, her small voice quiet but certain. Yes, she said, and I gave a small nod in return, then stood again, returning to the same steady posture as before. I looked back at Emily one more time, and for a brief second, there was something softer in my expression, not weakness, not relief, just acknowledgement. You are not starting over, I said quietly. You are continuing exactly where you left off. The distinction mattered, and I could see that she understood it, because she did not look back at the suitcases again, she did not reach for them, she simply stood there, present, aligned with a reality that had always been hers, even if she had not fully seen it before. And as I turned slightly toward the door, preparing for what would come next, I knew that everything outside this room would now begin to adjust to what had been re-established inside it, not because it was forced, but because it had always been the truth, and now, finally, it was no longer being ignored. The door opened quietly a few minutes later, not with urgency, not with hesitation, just the steady rhythm of a system already adjusting itself. A member of Human Resources stepped in with a thin folder and a tablet, her posture composed, her movements precise. She greeted me first, then Emily, her tone respectful but efficient, because by now, the situation was no longer a question, it was a process already in motion. I gave a small nod, and she moved forward, placing the documents on the desk with careful alignment. Access has been fully restored, she said, her voice clear. All system permissions, credentials, and departmental notifications have been updated. I did not respond immediately, I simply looked at the folder, then at Emily, allowing the moment to exist without interruption, because this was not just about paperwork, this was about confirmation, about reality catching up to truth. Emily stepped forward slowly, her hand hovering over the documents for a brief second before resting on them, not with hesitation, but with awareness, the kind that comes when something is returned that should never have been taken in the first place. Your position remains unchanged, the woman continued, glancing at her tablet. All previous responsibilities and reporting structures have been reinstated effective immediately. I nodded once, and she understood that was all that was required. No further explanation, no additional reassurance, just execution. She stepped back, giving space again, and the room returned to its quiet state, but it was a different quiet now, one that carried completion rather than tension. I looked at Emily as she opened the folder, her eye scanning the page, not searching for proof, but acknowledging it, confirming what had already been established, and I could see it clearly, the final piece settling into place, not dramatically, not emotionally, but firmly, like something locking into position exactly where it belonged. She closed the folder after a moment, holding it lightly, not gripping it, not clinging to it, just holding it as something that now matched the reality she stood in. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady, directed toward me, not the staff member, and I met her gaze without softening, without changing tone, just acknowledging it with a slight nod, because gratitude was not what defined this moment, clarity did. I turned toward the woman from Human Resources. "That will be all," I said calmly, and she nodded, gathering her tablet before stepping out as quietly as she had entered, the door closing behind her with the same controlled finality as everything else in this room. I walked toward the window again, looking out over the city, the buildings, the movement, the quiet order that most people never think about but always rely on, and I spoke without turning back, my voice even, grounded. "What happened today was not about them being stronger," I said, letting the words carry through the room. "It was about them thinking no one would correct them." I paused briefly, then added, "That is the difference." Behind me, I could hear Emily shift slightly, not uncertain, not hesitant, just adjusting into her place. Her actual place, not the one someone else had tried to assign to her. I turned back slowly, meeting her eyes one last time, and for the first time since we entered this building, there was nothing left unresolved between us, no confusion, no question, just understanding. People will test limits when they believe those limits do not exist, I continued calmly, and they will continue until someone shows them otherwise. I let that settle before finishing. "Today, that happened," she nodded. Not because she needed to agree, but because she already understood, and I glanced briefly toward the suitcases still near the door, untouched, unnecessary, a reminder of a version of reality that no longer applied. Then back to her. "You can leave those," I said quietly, "they belong to a moment that is already over." She followed my gaze, then looked back at me, and without a word, she stepped forward, past them, not picking them up, not looking back, just moving forward, and that was all that mattered. I gave a small nod, not approval, not encouragement, just acknowledgement, and as I reached for the door, opening it with the same steady motion as before, I knew something had been restored that went beyond position, beyond title, something quieter, stronger, and far more difficult to take away once it is fully understood. And as we stepped out into the hallway together, I said one final thing, not louder, not softer, just exactly as it needed to be. They did not lose power today. I paused for half a second, then finished. They just learned they never had it.